my name is Tom Barry. I work with the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, or CAFF, which is the Biodiversity Working Group in the Arctic Council. And CAFF operates on that boundary between policy or science and policy, and we work to transform and communicate findings generated by our monitoring and assessment programs into a form that can impact and inform policy and decision making across the Arctic. And it's a challenging task, but it's very fascinating. Defining the Arctic is always a very challenging task, and this red line defines the area within which CAFF operates. Now, this is a huge area. It covers well over 32 million square kilometres, which amounts to a little short of 6% of the surface of the Earth. And about 50%, or a little over that, is comprised totally of Arctic marine areas. Now, when people talk about the Arctic, they always tend to say that we need more information, we need more data, and we need more science. And while all of this is, of course, true, there is already an awful lot of information being generated across the Arctic, existing information being generated by scientists, by indigenous peoples, and local communities. And perhaps one of the largest challenges that we face is how do we better coordinate that information? How do we better ensure that it's harmonized and that it can be made accessible in a way that will allow Arctic states to use that information and inform their policy and decision making across this huge area? This is an issue that's been, I think, recognized and emphasized in every ministerial declaration from the Arctic Council since its formation. But it's proved a very challenging task to actually resolve and answer. And as you can see at the Arctic Circle, every year there is session after session where they talk about the need to harmonize, the need to work together, the need to coordinate and communicate. And it's a tough task to do because we all work in similar but yet dissimilar environments and countries. So the way that the Arctic Council has tried to approach this issue, at least with regards to biodiversity, is that they have been developing over the last several years and implementing what we call the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Programme. Now, this is an ecosystem-based programme. It's comprised of 4 components, each focused on a specific ecosystem type. So you have freshwater, you have terrestrial, you have coastal, and you have marine, which is the subject of our talk today. So it's a very complicated package of processes, but what might help you to visualize this is if you think of all of the Arctic biodiversity assessments and reports that the Arctic Council generates. These are the digital baseline, and this monitoring program is the engine that drives that baseline forward, that keeps it current, and that allows us to maintain a dynamic baseline and understanding of what's happening in the Arctic. And by doing that, that also helps us respond to another important challenge in the Arctic, and that relates to shortening the response time between when an issue is identified, we actually manage to come together, assess what's happening, and then develop the management options, the decisions, the tools that can be used to inform decision and policy making across the Arctic. So in order to address this within the marine ecosystem in the Arctic, we managed to pull together what's known as the Arctic Biodiversity or Marine Biodiversity Monitoring Plan. And this is essentially an agreement across all the Arctic states to compile and harmonize and compare information generated by existing monitoring programs across the Arctic. In order to do so, we established a framework of 6 expert networks which looked at issues from marine mammals to benthos to often overlooked issues such as plankton and seabirds and things like this. And what these expert networks did over a space of several years is they worked intensively to try and identify what they felt were the key components of the marine Arctic ecosystem. And these are components that if there's a change in one of them, that may indicate a greater trend at work, and it's something that we need to monitor and track and pay attention to. So it was a significant achievement to get all of these countries and scientists together and to agree upon these focal ecosystem components. In order to facilitate the reporting from this, we also went through a process to identify 8 physically and biogeochemically distinct Arctic marine areas. Because one of the challenges faced in Arctic science is always, how do you communicate the outputs of your work to the people that need to hear it? And unfortunately, scientists often fall down in that. Fantastic work is done, but there's somehow a challenge in communicating or imparting that information to the people that need to know it and to hear it. So the outcomes of all of this work was, at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting in May, we produced this report, which is the first integrated report on the state of Arctic biodiversity. In this report, we were able to outline what existing monitoring programs tell us about the changes happening in the Arctic marine ecosystem. We were able to identify a range of key findings and, more importantly, a whole range of specific advice for monitoring, all of which was directed towards decision and policymakers in the Arctic. And while all of that is an important step forward, and it'll help inform states and guide them as they start to try and better coordinate and harmonise their work across the Arctic, perhaps for me, what I feel is the most important outcome of this is that we now have in place a framework by which we can conduct repeatable and, in a quicker manner, assessments of what the status of marine biodiversity across the Arctic is. And this is perhaps best illustrated by a series of graphical tools that we've developed to try and convey the information that we've actually developed through this marine biodiversity monitoring program. This circle graph that you see here, each section represents a specific species group, from seabirds to fish to marine mammals and so on. And each concentric circle represents the status of monitoring for those particular species groups. Now, at least to me, the usefulness of such a tool is immediately apparent, because you can see what trends are occurring, where there are gaps in our knowledge, where we can try and need to focus our monitoring efforts in a more cohesive way. We developed this sort of traffic light system where you can see where monitoring is good, where it's moderate, where it's poor, or where none exists at all. And for example, you can see here, with regards to monitoring of fish species, it's good in the Arctic, or the Atlantic Arctic, but in the Hudson Bay complex, it's considered sporadic. And that raises the question, why? What is different between those two areas, and what can we do to try and harmonise or improve that situation? So this automatically is a very useful tool that can contribute both to Arctic Council efforts, national efforts, and to broader regional initiatives that look at coordinated monitoring and trying to understand what's happening across the Arctic. What we also did was we can break that tool down into 6 individual graphical tools which represent each of those species groups. And this particular one here looks at trends in abundance for marine mammals across the Arctic. So here it's the same process. Each concentric circle represents a specific focal ecosystem component, from polar bears, walrus, various different seal types. And each segment represents the Arctic marine area. So, for example, you can see here, those particular circles, the green circles, represent increasing populations of bowhead whales. And this shows that there are, of the 6 Arctic marine areas in this program, populations are increasing. In one of them, it is not. And why is that? It raises questions that you see, okay, what's happening? Why is it happening? What do we need to do? And one thing to keep in mind is that when we prepare this first use of these tools, is that we use all the existing information we could access, and there could well be, and probably is, many sources of information which we were unable to access, but hopefully in future iterations we will. But the usefulness of this, both at a circumscale and a national scale, I think is readily apparent. We can also then try and use other means to sort of visually convey that information. For example, this here shows the status of marine mammal stocks by Arctic marine area. So there's these different tools for each of these species groups across this program, and they really do help you focus your attention on where efforts are good, where more attention is needed, where there are areas of concern, and what we need to focus our attention. CAFF's focus as well is that we try to ensure that all of the information generated by such monitoring activities is readily available, and it's there for whoever wants to use it to try and improve our common understanding of what's happening to Arctic biodiversity. We do this by a program known as the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service. This serves as an Arctic node for global data warehouses such as the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GEO, the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, and UNESCO's Ocean Biogeographic Information System. So all of the information that lies behind those graphics and those maps and this report are readily available for anyone who wants to use them and improve upon them, or leave us know where we're missing information, where we can improve on that as well for future iterations. So for me, the key message from our work in developing this State of Biodiversity report is not so much the report itself, it's a framework we've managed to put in place which will allow us to conduct repeatable assessments in a quicker manner and a more focused manner in the coming years. And to me, that's crucial. And it's maybe good to end on a small example to illustrate why this is so important. For between 1979 and 2013, ice-free areas across the Arctic increased from 5 to 20 weeks in some areas. And this is an enormous change. I know it's often, especially at conferences like this, presented as a climate story, which of course it is. But I'd also like you to think of that sea ice, that disappearing sea ice, and the habitat. Because many of the much loved and species that we depend upon in the Arctic for various different reasons rely upon sea ice for their home. And when that sea ice disappears, their life becomes unpredictable. And that's the core challenge we're facing, that we're trying to understand a system that is at its most dynamic that it's ever been, and that's a difficult task to do.